Hello and welcome to our first regional webinar on ESG in Africa. I'm Thilen Pillay, and I'm a director at RSM South Africa in our risk advisory division. I also sit on the RSM Global ESG Global Leadership Group from an African standpoint. And I'm joined today by Martin Mulenga from RSM Zambia. Martin's an assistant audit manager in the Zambia practice, but he's actually has numerous amount of experience in ESG projects, particularly in developing ESG strategies from an African context perspective. So thank you, Martin. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Thilen.
I think I'm going to just kick off with a quote that I'd like to share with you. ESG is not just about doing good; it's about doing well by doing good. Sustainability is not separate from the business; it's part of the strategy for long-term growth. And I think what this essentially means is that by fostering eco synergy amongst the E, the S, and the G, being environmental, societal, and governance aspects, and focusing on creating shared value, companies can achieve superior competitive advantages, as well as operational efficiencies and a positive impact on society and the environment. So it really is that shared value component, which we're going to touch on a little bit later in this webinar. And this holistic approach not only aligns with principles of sustainable development, but also embeds these principles into the core business strategy, leading to sustainable profit and growth at the same time. So let's just maybe take a bit of a refresher or a bit of a step back if you're new to ESG. So what is it and why does it matter, especially from an African context perspective? So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. So these three factors investors are increasingly considering in their decision-making process. And not just investors, but stakeholders throughout essentially the value supply chain in most businesses, and certainly across the developed and first world economies. Over the past few decades, ESG has evolved from a niche concern into a mainstream business imperative. So in today's global landscape, the issues are more important than ever before. Taking into consideration, obviously, those investor considerations and various stakeholder considerations as well. And I think it's garnered that importance because of the shared value growth components and sustainable development components that we're going to be talking about. Research suggests that there is a strong correlation between ESG performance and financial performance, and once again tying in that sort of shared value. So from that perspective, and investors are more and more interested in companies with strong ESG credentials, and not essentially just greenwashing from that perspective, but really inculcating it into the bedrock of the company. And addressing these sort of ESG risks can not only protect a company from reputational damage, but also open them up to a variety of new opportunities that they're able to build into their business strategy. So, and this then further talks to, when we're talking about the shared value component, we need to be able to bring in the triple bottom line. And so what is that triple bottom line? The triple bottom line is people, planet, and profit. So from a people standpoint, we're talking about the social responsibility aspect. From a planetary standpoint, we're talking about environmental health. And obviously from a profit standpoint, we're talking about the economic viability of the business, because that is, why we're in business at the end of the day, but we want to be able to do it from a sustainable perspective. And a successful ESG approach balances all three of these components when we're talking about a triple bottom line. So the growing importance of ESG, the businesses are now held accountable for their ESG performance by various stakeholders, as I mentioned already, investors, but also employees, customers, regulators, and the public. And you wouldn't have thought employees, but employees they do not want, no longer, the trend is that they no longer want to essentially work for companies that do not have a strong ESG credentials in terms of the way that they run the business, the way that they are growing, from that perspective, and actually showing their commitment to the environment from that standpoint. And certainly from a regulator standpoint, we're starting to see this come up more and more. We'll talk about CSRD, which is an EU directive that's been published. And people might think, it's just an EU directive, why it matters from an Africa standpoint, but we'll talk about that and we'll bring it into scope and position for you. But from an Africa standpoint, as far as regulators are concerned, it's been a little bit slow. And we know that, that it is still coming. There's been a lot of guidance framework, certainly within South Africa from a JSE standpoint in terms of the sustainability and climate disclosure guidance. And that is getting a bit wider throughout the Africa continent. So the continent. So the impact of ESG on long-term sustainability and business resilience is essentially that good ESG practices can mitigate risks, they can enhance reputation, simulate innovation, and ensure business continuity. Once again, building this all into our sustainable growth strategy of any particular business. So I think we're going to talk about sort of the current challenges from that aspect in terms of where do we sort of see the current challenges landscape from an ESG perspective at this point in time. And then straight after this, Martin's going to come in and talk a little bit further about ESG and sustainability as a value driver. So right now, there's the difficulties in quantifying and measuring ESG performance. And what that means is there's often ambiguity in determining which ESG factors to measure and how to measure them, and as well as how to report on them, especially if we do not have consistent standards from that aspect. And that then ties into the next challenge, which is the lack of standardized ESG reporting and differing regulatory requirements. So without a universal ESG reporting standard, businesses face confusion and inconsistencies in their reporting efforts. And that's why we have certain global ESG standards that have now come up and has been sort of prevalent for a while, but certainly the new ones are the CSRD EU directive, but more from a global reporting standpoint, we're looking at an IFRS S1 and S2. We'll talk about that a little bit further, and that gives businesses a bit of a more of a global transparent way to be able to report in terms of their ESG efforts. And then the next challenge is balancing short-term financial performance with long-term sort of sustainable growth. So it can be challenging to prioritize long-term ESG goals when they seem to conflict with the short-term financial objectives of the business. But with that in mind, if you were to juxtapose that essentially with your growth strategy and you were to embed that and essentially augment your business strategy and your growth strategy, building into it the ESG principles, you're going to find that those short-term financial objectives would essentially flow into and become part of your long-term ESG goals. You'd be able to inculcate that. And then lastly, we've got our integrating ESG factors into traditional business models and operations. So once again, trying to build these ESG principles, especially if you're just starting off in the very beginning, can really seem quite challenging and can be quite a bit of a daunting task, especially when we're trying to move from traditional business models into more sustainable development business models. From that aspect, businesses are struggling to understand how ESG factors fit within their existing frameworks and processes from that perspective. But hopefully with today's webinar, you're going to learn a little bit more. You're going to be able to take away certain key strategy considerations. And we'll talk about an eight-step process in terms of how you can essentially get started and be able to essentially augment that business strategy, and then ending with sort of our C-suite strategy considerations that need to be taken into consideration. So I think next we're going to just go into the ESG and the sustainability as a value driver. Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dylan. So as mentioned, ESG has now become something that is of an utmost importance, and it's something that needs to be looked at from different perspectives. And most companies are now using ESG and sustainability as a value driver, as it may be. And the areas where companies are now factoring in ESG is as a value driver is in areas such as risk management. There are areas where a company, based on the traditional financial analysis, cannot pick up certain risks. And these risks can come from issues such as poor environmental policies. These might lead to a company facing regulatory fines, as well as reputational damage or business disruptions. So risk management has now become a component that is being adding value by the ESG aspects uh, of the business. So if you look at ESG from a risk management point of view, you are able to then encompass everything that affects the company from an environmental point of view, as well as from the social and governance. So if you take a risk approach of looking at those three facets of your business, you are likely to cover pretty much almost all the risks that a business can face, and you're able to then come up with strategies that would mitigate those risks. Another aspect where ESG is viewed as a value driver is in relation to performance and profitability of companies. You'll see that with ESG, there's more of a need to be innovative in order to deal with audit problems, but in a more new way that encompasses things that were not previously being considered, such as the environment. An audit way of looking at business was just the bottom line, which was, are we being profitable? But then that brought about issues that affected the entire globe in terms of global warming and the like. So companies that are then being proactive to find ways of solving those problems in a more efficient and more sustainable manner, you've seen that their performance and profitability gets to increase because they'll reduce their costs and they will therefore attract customers to the products that they are producing, which are in line with the expectations of pretty much everyone. The other aspect is investor attraction. So companies that ESG that factor in ESG and sustainability will attract investors based on the fact that ethical investors will look at how a company does carries out their activities. Investors are considering ESG factors in their investment decisions on a daily basis. There are matrices that are being looked at by big hedge funds such as BlackRock. They look at how are you compliant with ESG principles. That is one of the key matrices for them to invest. And when you look at the younger generations, they are also more concentrating on sustainability in terms of the future of the world. And this is something that is constantly at the back of the minds of even customers before they buy anything. It is something that is constantly on their minds. So investors will be attracted to a product that they know will be sustainable as well as is managed in a manner that benefits pretty much everyone. The other aspect of it is reputation and brand value. So the companies that factor in ESG, you find that their reputation is going to be better than companies that do not factor in ESG simply by virtue of their products as well as their processes being in a manner that is transparent, being in a manner that brings about equity, being in a manner that brings about fairness, and therefore it makes them more appealing to customers, employees, as well as other partners. The other aspect is that companies that bring in ESG into their activities, they have a long-term sustainability. This is because these companies, they look at the long term of their activities. They don't look at the short term. Their concentration is not just on the bottom line. Their concentration is what value can we add, and add this value in a manner that is sustainable, in a manner that safeguards our employees, in a manner that safeguards our customers as well as our investors. This then means that they will consider things like climate change, the labor practices that they carry out, as well as the corporate governance in their companies. The other aspect is regulatory compliance. For companies that are already factoring in ESG, meaning they consider the environment, they consider the social aspects of their operations, they consider their governance, they are going to be compliant just by doing those things. The compliance laws that are coming up, the ones that are making it mandatory, are already going to be incorporated by these companies. So you find that their operations will not be disrupted for them to bring in new processes for them to comply, because the way that they've been running has already factored in those issues. Therefore, compliance becomes an issue, an easier issue for them. And then the other issue is to do with societal impact. This is not the list of the reasons why ESG is seen as a value driver, but it's one of the important aspects. The impact that the company has on the society can contribute to positive societal outcomes. These are environmental conservation, social equality, as well as good governance. We can move to the next slide, Thelem. So with ESG, the three components, which is the environmental, the social, as well as the governance, do not live in silos. These live in a connected kind of environment. So eco-synergy is simply how the three components are interconnected in how they add value to companies. So this interconnectedness is what is called the eco-synergy. So eco-synergy is simply the ecological aspect of it, or ecological synergy, which is simply the synergy within the ESG. So these practices, which refers to the interconnectedness and mutually beneficial relationships between the environmental, the social, and the governance factors. So this synergy is how it works. You find that the environmental factor, companies will focus on reducing their environmental impact through sustainable practices, such as reducing greenhouse emissions, minimizing waste generation, as well as conserving natural resources. Whereas the social factor will look at companies prioritizing the social responsibilities by fostering inclusive workplaces, supporting community development initiatives, and ensuring fair labor practices throughout their supply chains. Whereas the governance factor, companies will emphasize a strong governance practices, including transparent decision-making processes, ethical business conduct, and accountability to their stakeholders. Therefore, eco-synergy within ESG involves the leveraging of this interconnectedness between these three factors to create value that benefits both the company and its stakeholders. For example, when you get the environmental and the social, investing in renewable energy not only reduces the company's carbon footprint, which is an environmental benefit, but it also creates job opportunities in the renewable energy sector, which then gives a social benefit. The social and the government and the governance will intertwine in the sense that where you implement fair labor practices throughout the supply chain, this obviously gives a social benefit, but it enhances the company's reputation and it reduces the risk of the supply chain disruptions due to labor-related issues. The environmental and governance will obviously interconnect in the sense that transparent reporting on environmental performance, which is an environmental, it will increase investor confidence and trust in the company's governance practices, which then gives you a governance benefit. So by integrating eco-synergy into ESG strategies, you find that companies can drive positive outcomes across environmental, the social, and the governance as dimensions, while also creating long-term value for their business as well as for their stakeholders. Thelem will be able to talk to us about the CSRD.
Thanks.
About the CSRD, yes.
Thanks, Martin. I think Martin's given a really good sort of background in terms of an understanding and explanation of essentially sustainability as a value driver, and then that concept of eco-synergy and essentially shared value, which I think bridges that gap quite nicely in terms of why should I focus on ESG, and not necessarily just focus on the profitability of my company, but realizing that from a long-term perspective that those two concepts are essentially intertwined from that perspective. So I think what we're going to talk about now is CSRD and IFRS S1 and S2. Those are so CSRD is sort of a newer directive from an EU standpoint. It significantly expands on the requirements of the non-financial reporting directive, which was previously the sort of the NFRD. And the main objective here is for transparency to sustainability matters and ensures companies report on their sustainability and risk impacts comprehensively. And that is essentially sort of the disclosure that is going to be required from certain EU entities. When we look at the scope and the relevance, essentially from an African context perspective, you might think that this only really pertains to EU companies, and certainly it does. We're looking at large companies in the EU, as well as companies that's listed on regulated markets in the EU. But when we're looking at market access and African businesses that essentially need to want to either expand into the EU market, certainly from your customer and base perspective, but also downwards from essentially if we're looking at multinationals, which with our holding companies in the EU and then your subsidiaries sitting in Africa, we have to look at it from a holistic standpoint. And those companies are then going to need to essentially employ CSRD compliance and disclosure compliance and reporting compliance from that perspective in order to be able to get access into the EU market. And this is one of the areas where we're trying to actually then bridge that gap between, okay, if you want to grow your business or you want to enter a newer market, this is essentially one of the areas that one of the requirements that you're going to need to be able to comply with from that perspective. So it doesn't just pertain to EU companies, it certainly does pertain to it does affect many multinational companies that operate in Africa, and especially African companies that want to essentially gain access to the EU market. And why wouldn't you from a growth perspective? Especially when you are doing exports into the EU economy, you are going to need to look at CSRD compliance from that perspective. And it does require quite detailed reporting. So it requires the disclosure of information on climate change, as well as environmental rights, social rights, human rights, and governance factors. So the reporting is quite onerous from that perspective when you're looking at the CSRD reporting. But it's also then looking at, well, if I'm a company and I'm going to be reporting from a CSRD perspective, and I'm sitting in an EU and I'm one of your, let's say, your customers, and I'm only looking to take you on based on one of the key factors being your sustainability and CSRD compliance initiatives, how do I know what you're saying is essentially a true reflection of your business? And that's where the third-party assurance comes in. So there is a third-party assurance component in CSRD, which mandates that reported information must be verified by an external third party. So that's where audit firms like ourselves come into play. And this increases the credibility of the disclosures that you're essentially making, not just to the EU regulators from that perspective, but certainly to your various stakeholders, as well as both in the EU as well as from an African context perspective. And then when we're looking at sort of the further relevance to African businesses, we're looking at European market access. So African businesses operating in or with business relations in the EU market, they need to be able to comply to maintain their business engagements, but also to be able to grow their business. And this is one of, if I were to tie it back to the very beginning, and certainly what Martin was talking about in terms of sustainability as a value driver and building it into your growth strategy, this is one of the areas where if we want to be, as African businesses, if we want to be able to expand, not just into the EU markets, but certainly into Asia Pacific markets, etc., and American markets, we need to be able to build this ESG initiatives and compliance to these standards into our growth strategies, in order for us to be able to access these new markets, to be able to increase our sort of profitability and financial performance. And the other aspect then is investment attractiveness. So adherence to these directives makes African businesses more attractive to EU investors that are looking for more sustainable and compliant investment opportunities. So we know from a large standpoint that our African markets are essentially untapped. And there's a lot of international investors that are looking to Africa to be able to get their footprint and their foot in the door, essentially, from an Africa standpoint. But that means them doing business with various African businesses. And they will only do that if ESG is on their radar and part of their business strategies, and certainly from their compliance requirements with African companies that essentially have the same values from a sustainable development perspective. The next two standards that I just want to talk about is IFRS S1 and S2. So when we're looking, that is essentially, so S1 focuses on the general requirements for disclosing sustainability related financial information. And S2 specifically targets climate-related disclosures. So there's a lot of standards that is certainly in South Africa from a JSE perspective, where they are separating the guidance out for sustainability guidance and climate guidance disclosures. But in terms of these particular two standards, this is essentially going to allow and provide guidance for companies on a sort of global scale in terms of how do I report and provide that standardized context in terms of reporting sustainability related information, as well as then climate related disclosures. So previously you've got the CSRD in Europe, you've got obviously the GRIs in terms of, your UN sustainability development goals, but there's various standards sort of globally. And what the IFRS S1 and S2 attempts is doing is essentially standardizing that on how companies essentially report this information. So if we are looking at a global company or a multinational entity with various counterparts all over the world, and we're reporting from an S1 and S2 perspective, we're able to do that in a standardized manner. If we're looking at various entities along our supply chain, and we are all following an S1 and S2 reporting framework, they're able to still do that in a standardized manner. So we're talking essentially the same language, and we're able to interpret the information better from that perspective. So where does that relevance then essentially leave us from an African business context in terms of S1 and S2? So on the climate risk side, given Africa's vulnerability to climate change, droughts, floods, changing weather patterns, the full shebang of global warming from that perspective, reporting under IFRS S2 can help businesses manage these risks better, because you're able to then look at what essentially is the climate risk. So you're able to identify it. You can't prepare for something if you don't know what your risks are. And that's what S2 essentially forces us to be able to do, is identifying what those risks are are, and then putting our strategies, our initiatives in place to be able to address those risks, and then ending in the disclosure thereof. And then from a global standards and compliance perspective, using IFRS standards can help African companies align with global financial reporting standards. And this is crucial for attracting international investors and partners. And then certainly from a sustainability initiatives. So these reporting standards encourage companies to develop and implement sustainable practices. This can lead to long-term economic benefits and resilience against environmental changes from that perspective. So we're certainly not, in isolation here from an Africa standpoint. We're part of a global economy, and we need to be able to see our relevance from that perspective as far as ESG is concerned. And to date, it's been a little bit of a slow uptick, but that is certainly going to be increasing the more pressure we get from our various stakeholders around the world in terms of our business interactions. I'm just going to hand over back to Martin, who's going to take us through from a strategy perspective and looking at the importance of a top-down and looking at that tone at the top and how it then filters throughout the entity, but then also then looking at sort of risks and opportunities from that aspect. Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Thielen. And like they say, everything starts and ends with leadership. So in terms of the top-down approach, leadership plays a very critical role in ensuring that any strategy is adopted and implemented in the company. So in this aspect of ESG, you find that leadership will play a very pivotal role in setting the ESG vision, the values, as well as the objectives. If the tone at the top is nonchalant to the ESG initiative, then you find that the entire organization is going to be nonchalant, because the culture is usually set by the people that are at the top. The behaviors and the way people value or view something that is new, like ESG, yes, has been there for a while, but this is now when most companies are actually trying to implement it and trying to make sure that they are compliant with these regulations. And therefore, leadership is what is going to be very key in making sure that there is this compliance and therefore uptake by companies in terms of embracing ESG. There is always a trickle-down effect from leadership, because leadership is the one that will set whatever strategy is set, all the budgets that will be made in terms of what the company needs to achieve are then going to follow that strategy. So if the strategy or the top management are not paying so much attention to this, or they are not setting policies that are going to implement or that are going to foster ESG, then there's going to be a trickle-down effect of that negative kind of approach, and the company is therefore going to lag behind and will not be able to get the benefits that come from ESG. So therefore, this process has to be driven by senior management, and it has to involve the CEO as well as the board. They need to set up the strategy, and that needs to cascade to all the different levels of the organization, to middle management as well as to the operations. Once that strategy is set, then targets can also be set where a benchmark can be used to determine whether they're actually meeting those goals. Because another saying that is there is, whatever is not measured will definitely not get done. Can we move to the next slide? Yes. Now, when we come to risks and opportunities, so in terms of the of ESG, there are a lot of risks and there are a lot of opportunities as well. But the first thing that needs to be done is to identify and assess what risks are actually going to arise from ESG, as well as how can you then translate those risks into financial risks, and how can you then mitigate those risks. And in that line, you'll find that there will also be opportunities that will arise from ESG. So now some of the risks that can arise are going to be things to do with reputational risk. So failure to address ESG issues can lead to reputational damage, loss of customer trust, and negative publicity, which can ultimately impact sales and the brand value of the company. There's also a regulatory risk that can arise. Non-compliance with environmental, social, and governance regulations will result in fines. It can also result in legal action and just increased operational costs. There's also the operational risk. Inefficient use of resources, supply chain disruptions, and poor management of environmental and social risks can lead to increased operational costs and decreased profitability. You are also going to find that there will be financial risks that come from ESG issues, such as climate change, as we've seen. Climate change, the rainfall patterns have been very erratic. For example, in Zambia right now, we have pretty much what is a mini drought. That is going to mean that we are not going to have as much produce, and it's going to lead to the prices of food going up, which means the price of labor will go up, and eventually it gets to affect the companies. It will also include, it also includes asset devaluation. There will be increased insurance costs and an impaired access to capital. If you don't factor in ESG issues and investors, we talked about investor confidence. Investors that feel this company is not sustainable will withhold their capital, and therefore there will be that financial impact on the company. There's also a reputational risk, as we have mentioned, that is going to come on a company that doesn't factor in these ESG policies. Now, these risks that arise from ESG mainly will be in those lines, and a company needs to position itself in a way that it understands these risks, understands what is the impact, and how can it then address these risks. And in as much as there are risks, as mentioned, there are also going to be a lot of opportunities, and there are a lot of opportunities that arises from ESG. For example, the money that has been spent on ESG so far is in excess of 1 trillion, and it's expected that in the next 30 years, about 30 trillion will be spent just on sustainability and ESG. So there's a lot of opportunity, therefore, for companies that will be innovative, and it will give them that competitive advantage as well as an investor appeal. As a company, for anything that is a weakness, you have to try as much as possible to convert it into a strength. So you find that these risks that we have identified under ESG, a company can then convert them to be something that is positive and something that will be an opportunity. For example, opportunities can come also from enhanced brand reputation. Companies that prioritize ESG and sustainability can build a positive brand image, which then enhances customer loyalty, and they will gain a competitive advantage in the marketplace. Also, the other opportunities are in terms of cost savings. Implementing sustainable practices such as energy efficiency and waste reduction will lead to cost savings that then lead to reduced energy consumption, resource efficiency, as well as operational efficiency. Another opportunity, as mentioned, is access to capital. There's a big move to companies being net zero in terms of their carbon emissions, meaning companies are buying green credits from other areas where they will net off with their emissions, such that eventually what they're buying in credits will offset their emissions. And therefore, countries such as Zambia, for example, where we have massive portions of land, and we can then use that land to get those credits, which we can sell to other to these countries or to these companies that are emitting, so that they then also become net zero. There's also innovation and market differentiation that can come from ESG, as well as attracting and retaining talent. As mentioned initially, a lot of new employees, they value adding value to the society as well as to the environment. they are more conscious of the products that they buy in terms of how has this product been produced, how has this product affected on the environment, and they would like to be part of a company that then is going to factor in those things, which then leads to the higher employee satisfaction, and it improves the retention rates, therefore increasing productivity and reducing on the cost of employment. I will pass it on back to you, Thilem, so that you can take us through the transforming ESG steps.
Thanks very much, Martin. I think that was a sort of a really good explanation from a risks and opportunities perspective. Certainly building and talking back into, sort of developing a sustainable growth strategy, and building in sort of ESG into that. So, we don't just have risks, we always have opportunities as well from that perspective. But once again, going back to the ESG strategy and how do we get started in terms of if we're new to the game, if we have put in some initiatives already, but we want to be able to increase our maturity from that standpoint. So we've put together sort of an 8-step process. Sounds like a lot, but with most things, you just need to be able to take it one step at a time, and ESG is no different from that perspective. So the first area that we've looked at is to be able to conduct an ESG maturity assessment, and that's something that we believe in quite holistically, and it gives you quite sort of a 360 view and a 360 approach from that aspect. And in terms of that, you're then able to, what you need to be able to do is develop an assessment criteria. And we at RSM, we've actually developed a model for that to be able to that you can assess against from a maturity standpoint. But the whole purpose of a maturity assessment is to look at where are you right now, because you can't just immediately put in initiatives. You need to determine what essentially is the status quo right now, and where do we stand, and then determine, okay, what do you want, where do you want to then be able to get to? And you're able to do this in various maturity levels, going all the way from an initial to sort of an emergent standpoint, and then going into sort of a leadership area in terms of maturity when we're talking about ESG. But you need to be able to know where you are. Your strategy can then assist you in developing initiatives and putting that in place to be able to say, this is where we are and this is where we need to be able to get to. But that maturity assessment is, from our perspective, would essentially be your first point of call. So developing that assessment criteria, you need to be able to perform that initial assessment using a maturity model to assess against your current ESG activities and policies. And as I said, this might be very a little to essentially to nil sort of activities, but there could be certain things that you're doing that you're just not aware of, within the course of essentially various business processes that is taking place. And the advantages to this is you're able to identify gaps and strengths that will then provide a clear understanding of where the company stands in terms of ESG practices and help to identify strong areas of those requiring improvement. The other advantage is that you're able to prioritize your efforts. Everything cannot be done at the same time, certainly from a financial perspective. And that's why prioritization of those efforts are very important. So it will help in allocating resources more efficiently by prioritizing those areas that need urgent attention or could have the greatest impact or on an overall ESG performance. And it'll also assist from benchmarking and tracking your progress. So it'll establish a baseline for future comparison and allow the organization to measure and communicate progress over time. So by incorporating an ESG maturity assessment at the outset, businesses can effectively tailor their ESG strategy to their specific context and capabilities, which will then lead to a more targeted and impactful sustainability efforts. This roadmap provides a comprehensive approach to ESG integration, ensuring that businesses not only comply with current standards, but also prepare for future challenges and opportunities. The next step then will be to establish ESG commitment and leadership. So Martin spoke about, transformation and essentially the top-down approach, and this is absolutely critical. You need to be able to secure executive buy-in and leadership from the get-go. If you aren't able to do this, you're not going to be successful in your strategy. So the actions to be able to take place here is leadership buy-in. You need to engage the board and senior management to understand the benefits and necessity of ESG integration. And to a large extent, this is ESG awareness and how it essentially, it's not just, it's not a cost, it's not just compliance, but we see it as a value driver from a growth perspective. And that's where this education and awareness comes in. And then appoint ESG champions, because you can always talk about it in the beginning, certainly from a leadership perspective, and then nothing essentially happens. But if we are serious about it, we can appoint ESG champions and designate those leaders who will be responsible for driving ESG initiatives across different departments. That way, we're able to essentially start with that top-down approach and be able to inculcate this leadership throughout the business. The next step then will be to set those ESG goals and strategies. So we want to be able to define that strategic ESG goals based on the maturity assessment results, and then align them with the business objectives. The actions that you need to be able to take out of this, or that will be forming part of this critical third step, will be to develop smart ESG goals. So nothing that is essentially unrealistic. We need to use insights from the maturity assessment, once again, to set those specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound goals. It needs to be specific. It needs to be measurable. It can't just be essentially what I'd like to use the term, thumbs ups. This is essentially, blue sky type of goals. We need to have measurable goals from this perspective, and they need to be realistic and achievable. From that perspective. If they're not, it's not going to take place. And you need to be very realistic and pragmatic when you're developing these particular goals. Certainly when you're starting off from an ESG standpoint. And then once those goals are essentially developed and then the strategy has been developed, we then go into an implementation phase, which we then looks at implementing those ESG initiatives that we need to be able to attain. So from an actions perspective here, we're looking at initiative planning and resource allocation. So we need to plan detailed ESG projects and allocate the necessary resources, including budget and personnel. They go essentially hand in hand from that perspective. And then we need to be able to launch those initiatives. So just kicking them off is not good enough. We need to be able to take them all the way. And if you project plan those initiatives from start to end, you're then able to realize those initiatives, which then talks into the measurable and achievable portion of your strategy from that aspect. Going into step 5, we're looking at monitoring and measuring. So this is key in this process. And I just want to just take a step back here. This 8-step process is not sort of a once-off process. It is a reiterative process. When we're looking at monitoring and measuring, it's going to be consistent. It's going to be periodic. We need to continuously monitor and measure our progress against our ESG steps, much like you will continuously monitor and measure your progress against your normal business strategy from that perspective. And this is going to require you to set KPIs from an actionable perspective and establish KPIs based on your ESG strategy and your goals, and then establish regular reporting. And we need to implement mechanisms for regular reporting and of ESG performance, both internally and externally. And the internal perspective is essentially going to be from our executive management and our board of directors standpoint, but certainly from an external perspective, we need to be able to build in that reporting. There might be compliance reporting that we need to do. There's going to be annual reporting from an IFRS S1 and S2, should you choose to be able to adopt those standards. Going into step 6, communication and reporting. So it's great that we want to be able to do all of this from an ESG perspective, but it doesn't help if we're not able to communicate adequately and effectively from that standpoint. So we need to be able to prepare ESG reports from an action standpoint, develop comprehensive ESG reports that are shared with stakeholders. Because what's the good in us doing all of this if we're not sharing all of our wins, if we're not sharing how we're progressing from an ESG standpoint? And this is going to help increase your reputation and brand value and facilitate stakeholder engagement, which is the next action, to use multiple channels to communicate ongoing ESG initiatives and communication. And then step 7, looking at review and enhance. What I said was this is a reiterative process. So we need to continuously improve ESG strategies and practices based on our performance. And the only way we're going to know that is if we go from step 5, monitor our progress, communicate, and then we go back into a review and enhance stage where we need to then conduct our annual reviews. We need to evaluate effectiveness of the ESG strategy. How effective has it been? Do we need to revise it? Do we need to be able to reassess our goals? Did we think something that was achievable and it's not necessarily achievable? And then going back into stakeholder feedback, incorporate the feedback from all the stakeholders to refine our ESG practices. And then the very last step being able to foster a culture of sustainability from that perspective. And this is going to require actions like ESG training and education, as well as incentives and recognition. So recognize and reward contributions to the company's ESG performance. I'm just going to end on this, our webinar, just looking at everything that we've spoken about to date, and then the core objectives in terms of what we want to be able to take away from a C-suite strategy. So if you are a C-suite member, what do you want to be able to take away from this? Leadership and commitment to an alignment with our business objectives. The C-suite must commit to ESG principles and understand how they align with the overall business objectives of the entity. You'd also want to look at an ESG materiality assessment, and this will come into play if you're doing a full 360 assessment, maturity assessment. And this is going to require you, with the help of cross-functional teams, you'll conduct this materiality assessment to identify the ESG issues that are most relevant to the business, the industry, and stakeholders. The next aspect would be, based on that materiality assessment, the C-suite needs to develop a strategic plan that aligns with ESG initiatives with business objectives. Going into risk assessment and mitigation, what Martin spoke about earlier in terms of risks opportunities, we need to be able to identify those potential ESG-related risks that could impact the business and develop a plan to essentially mitigate them. And then develop an operational plan. So strategy is one thing, but we need to be able to operationalize our strategy. Looking then to implementation and monitoring, execute the operational plan, and set up a system for monitoring progress towards ESG goals. And then lastly, looking at our reporting and communication once again, regularly reporting on ESG performance to stakeholders, critical in terms of increasing our reputation and brand awareness, and certainly from a compliance standpoint, which includes our board, investors, employees, and the public. Reporting should be transparent and align with our recognized ESG reporting standards from that perspective, and then entering our continuous improvement and innovation perspective, talking to this reiterative process. So we've gone a little bit over time, but I think it was essentially well worth the time for us to be able to spend on these particular topics. I'd like to thank Martin for joining me from RSM Zambia. Please feel free to reach out to assistance reach out to us for assistance from an ESG strategy development standpoint, and certainly from a maturity assessment perspective. So thank you all once again, and thank you for attending.